sad things about philosophy in Australia and New Zealand is we often tend to forget our history. And I think that Jack has perhaps the leading person to make sure that both in Australia, both in New Zealand, and also throughout the world, that we have remembered prior. And for that reason, I think it's absolutely wonderful that he's able to come and tell us some more about the history of our subject.
Thanks, Max. So we had two fascinating papers yesterday about prior and possible world semantics. One by Annetta, who, if you were there for her paper, looked at Prior's very early work in an unpublished manuscript called The Craft of Formal Logic, where Prior emerges as this person who's sort of just about to start doing possible world semantics for modal logic. He doesn't think of it in those terms, of course, but he wants to talk about reducing signs of modality to signs of quantity. He wants to quantify over possible worlds or possible states of affairs, as he calls them at that time, in order to give an account of the modal operators. So that's at one end of the scale, very early, 1950, 1951. And then we had a paper by Max talking about sort of the later Prior, where Prior is, if not exactly hostile to possible world semantics, certainly not very interested in it, and you did quote some passages where he does express really something close to hostility to the whole enterprise. And I think you said in the discussion of Annetta's paper, it's as though the later stuff was written by a different person to the early stuff. So kind of what happened? Well, I want this morning to kind of try and join up the dots. What did happen in the middle between Craft of Formal Logic in 1951 and the later mature Prior during the 1960s, kind of reacting to you know, the model theoretic semantics that was exploding on the scene at that time? I think that the period of the sort of early development of modal semantics is characterized by a lot of different, relatively independent approaches done by lots of different people who weren't necessarily talking to each other. Some of them were, some of them weren't. And that there are two quite different kind of semantical technologies that were competing, at least two different semantical technologies that were competing in those early days. There was the truth conditional semantics, you know, primarily Kripke, but there was a lot of activity before Kripke. And then there was another approach which might be called translational semantics, which Prior and others were following. Truth conditional semantics certainly won the competition, but I nevertheless think it's very interesting to look back at that earlier technology, translational semantics, and you know, see what it's got to be said for it and try and figure out why it lost the competition and is there anything about it of interest for research today. And I think the answer to that last question is, well, yes, there is, because the translational approach offers features that the standard truth conditional account doesn't. As Hans mentioned, it's ontologically lighter. I mean, you don't buy into set theory. You're not ascribing these complicated set theoretic entities as semantic values of the modal expressions. It's kind of much closer to the homophonic ideal than standard truth conditional semantics. It isn't strictly homophonic, but it's much closer to that ideal. And the same question arises with respect to Prior's translational semantics for propositional modal logic, as arises with respect to the semantics that Hans was just talking about for the tense modal equivalent. Is it going to scale up? And although Prior never discusses this explicitly, I think one of the reasons why he probably didn't push translational semantics during the 1960s as hard as he conceivably could have done was because he thought that it wouldn't scale up in an interesting way. And Jim Levine, I think, is going to give a paper this afternoon that very probably bears on this issue of why Prior backed off a bit from translational semantics. I suspect that Prior could see no way of scaling up to the quantificational case without bringing the Barkhan formula, the reviled Barkhan formula as far as Prior was concerned, along with the semantics. If that was Prior's reasoning, I actually think he was wrong about that, because there is a sense in which Prior's translational semantics can be scaled up without the Barkhan formula. But that's kind of another story. I won't talk about the details of that this morning, but probably will do in the for publication version of this paper. I'm also going to try and set Prior's translational semantics in historical context by talking about what other people were doing a bit earlier and a bit later and at the same time as Prior, and who were Prior's main influences. I'm not going to, my brain's still a bit addled from jet lag, so I'm not going to depart too far from my script from this point on. So as we all know, there's a tendency to describe the possible world semantics as the Kripke semantics, but there was plenty of action before Kripke. And partisan accounts concerning the work of one or another contributor to possible world semantics during the pre-Kripkean era sometimes simply increase rather than lessen the confusion that surrounds the history of possible world semantics. For example, Follersdal recommends that possible world semantics be called the Kanger-Kripke semantics, but this term is even less accurate than the term Kripke semantics. Kanger never had possible worlds. He had a purely model theoretic account. He did have a binary relation between models, not worlds, but it was almost an algebraic relation. He inherited it from Bjornson and Tarski, who certainly didn't have possible worlds. Kanger just wasn't thinking in terms of possible worlds. Yet he's often said to be one of the founding fathers of the possible world semantics, but possible worlds was just absent from his account. So I'm going to relate what I hope is part of the true story of the early years of possible world semantics. But I'm going to fail to mention many important figures because of time constraints. So I thought I should just list a few of the unmentioned people. Byatt, a particularly interesting character who anticipated the Kripke semantics, Completeness for S5, which Kripke published in 1959. Byatt was already there with an essentially possible worlds account just a little bit before Kripke. So I shan't say anything about very early figures either, including Leibniz and Leibniz's precursors, and my rather arbitrarily chosen starting point is Carnap, but I've collected together some quotations that I won't actually be talking about, but I thought you might like simply to gaze at them. They're so it's, one of the facts that makes them so interesting is just that they're so early in the history of possible world semantics. The first one from Peirce, of course, and Prior quoted those same quotes, and that was clearly a great influence in Prior's development of the possible world semantics. I love that quote from Russell. It's just so early. And I've got some quotes here from Wittgenstein and also from G.E. Moore. Moore had at this point just defined entailment in terms of the converse of deducibility in that very famous paper of his. And then he goes on to, a few pages later, to suggest a possible worlds interpretation of the modal connective entailment. And these quotes from Wittgenstein, again, they're quoted by Prior, a very strong influence on Prior in his development of possible world semantics. Well, first, let me summarize the essentials of the story. There are these three main threads to the history of possible world semantics. There's the basic idea that the modalities are to be analyzed in terms of quantification over possible worlds. And secondly, there's the use of the binary relation or some equivalent, topological equivalent conditions or something like that. The so-called accessibility relation between worlds, to use Prior's term. And it seems that Meredith and Prior were the first to give a possible world semantics employing the binary relation in joint work that they did in 1956, although certainly not a truth conditional semantics. And the third thread in the story is the search for completeness proofs. And so far as I've been able to discover, the first person to announce completeness proofs for the propositional systems T, S4, and S5 relative to a semantics explicitly interpreted in terms of the idea of a possible world was Timothy Smiley in 1957, 2 years before Kripke's great paper, A Completeness Theorem in Modal Logic, in the JSL in 1959, although Kripke submitted it in 1958. But in any case, Smiley was a year or two earlier even than the date of submission. And I won't be talking about the quantified story much this morning, but just to note, the earliest possible world's completeness proofs for quantified T and S4 were produced by Hintecker and Kripke in a glorious photo finish. It's, if you actually look at the surviving documents, it's completely unclear which of them was first. In one of Kripke's papers, he does include a note to say that, well, actually Hintecker did this first. But Kripke says, oh, I just put that note in because I was told to. But if you actually look at the evidence, it's by no means certain that Hintecker was first. And in fact, the question's open. So my starting point is Carnap in 1946. If only because Pryor mentions Carnap's work where he's just first unfolding the possible world semantics in The Craft of Modal Logic in 1951. So Carnap's clearly an influence on Pryor. So Carnap's 1946 paper, Modalities and Quantification, contained the first technical work in possible world semantics, and it's remarkable in its scope. The paper offers a semantics for quantified S5. It's got the thesis of the necessity of identity, semantical validations of the Barkhan formula and its converse, and much else besides. And in this paper, Carnap announced soundness proofs for propositional and quantified S5, but he left the question of completeness open. So although Carnap kicked off the technical inquiry, there was no binary relation and no treatment of systems weaker than S5 and no completeness proofs. So the next step in the story is Tarski and Jornsen. They were basically doing algebra, and they were working in the McKinsey tradition. Tarski had earlier published a paper with McKinsey, and the results were kind of extended by Tarski and Jornsen. And their whole approach was to enrich Boolean algebras with new operators. And then they proved rather general theorems connecting their Boolean algebras with sets having certain relations between their elements. And with hindsight, these theorems can be viewed as, in effect, a treatment of all the basic modal systems and corresponding properties of the accessibility relation. And in 1963, in one of his publications, Kripke described their work as the most surprising anticipation of his own work on modal semantics. And in correspondence, he said this to me. Had they known that they were doing modal logic, they would have had the completeness problem for many of the modal propositional systems wrapped up and some powerful theorems. Mathematically, they did this, but it was presented as algebra with no mention of modal logic or possible worlds, let alone quantifiers. When I presented my paper at the conference in Finland in 1962, I emphasized the importance of their paper. Tarski was present and said that he was unable to see any connection with what I was doing. So Kripke regards Jornsen and Tarski's work as, quote, the most striking anticipation of his own work, but there's certainly no hint of truth-conditional meta-theory to be found in the Jornsen and Tarski papers. So an anticipation of modern truth-conditional modal semantics needn't itself be truth-conditional in nature. And as I'll explain, Pryor's account certainly wasn't truth-conditional in nature, but nevertheless it's a key precursor of Semantics can and sometimes does consist in the provision of systematic translations of the sentences of one language into another semantically more perspicuous language. Translating sentence of a modal language into French or even Polish is unlikely to help much, but appropriate systematic translations of modal statements into a possible world's language can indeed be used to give an account of the meanings of the modal statements involved. So that's translational semantics. That's what Prior and others were doing. You might call Prior's approach to studying the meaning of the modal operators simply translational semantics without qualification, were it not for the fact that Timothy Smiley already coined this term for his own brand of non-truth conditional modal semantics, which I'll say a bit more about in a few minutes. But I'm happy to call Prior's approach translational semantics and Smiley's approach translational semantics in the Smiley style in order to mark the difference between the two. But essentially they were pursuing a very similar route. But first, Prior in 1951 to 1954. As Annette has already explained, the idea that the modalities can be analysed in terms of quantification over possible states of affairs is set out in the 1951 manuscript, The Craft of Formal Logic. And Prior suggested that, quote, signs of modality are just ordinary quantifiers operating upon a peculiar subject matter, namely possible states of affairs. Not long after this, Prior became the first to use the binary relation in an explicitly modal context, and the first to employ an accessibility-like interpretation of that relation. Hans has just talked about this. The accessibility is, it's like at one time being accessible from another time. And that's what Prior did in 1953, 1954. In the course of re-expressing propositions of his tense modal logics in the form of quantifications over times, Prior introduced his earlier than relation, and he imposed various conditions on this relation, including, for example, the transitivity condition that, as we all know, is needed to secure the tense modal analogue of the S4 reduction axiom. And in 1954, in his presidential address to a conference held in Wellington, New Zealand, Prior explained how his tense logical axioms can be derived if first-order predicate calculus is enriched with axioms expressing conditions on his binary relation. And that was exactly the same procedure that Prior was going to follow a year or two later with the Irish logician Carew Meredith in their pioneering work on possible world semantics in 1956. But before I talk about Prior and Meredith's joint work, I want to talk a little about the very early work of Richard Montague in 1955, which again is fascinating simply because it was so early in the story. There are other reasons why it's fascinating as well, but its earliness is just remarkable. So this was at UCLA in May 1955. Montague gave a talk entitled Logical Necessity, Physical Necessity, Ethics and Quantifiers. Montague's handwritten notes for this talk survive. I found them in the UCLA archive a couple of years ago. And the manuscript overlaps with, but is not identical to, its published successor of the same title, which didn't appear until 1960. And there are some significant differences between the published version and the 1955 manuscript. Montague didn't treat S5, but a nameless system of his own devising, which becomes equivalent to propositional S5 if box A, arrow A is added. Montague didn't want box A, arrow A in his system, the T axiom, because, as he pointed out, it failed in the ethical case from the fact that you ought to do, the fact that A ought to be the case, it doesn't follow that A is the case. So because he was interested in a general framework which would apply to ethics as well, the T axiom had to be out. He had some other reasons for disliking the T axiom as well, but the ethical one was the main one for him. So what he did was extended a Tarskian definition of satisfaction in a model to the modal case. And he borrowed from Tarski the satisfaction clauses for atoms and truth functions without alteration, Montague said. His satisfaction clause for the necessity operator involved a binary relation between models rather than worlds, but nevertheless, here he is using the binary relation in a clearly modal context very early on. And Montague stated a soundness theorem, but the burning question is, did he have a completeness theorem in 1955? He's sometimes said to have done, and the situation is clouded by the fact that in the published 1960 version of his paper, he remarks that his axiom system is complete with respect to his model theory. And then in a footnote, he compared his Tarski-style approach with Kripke's 1959 approach. But was this assertion of completeness 1955 knowledge, or was it added to the paper, you know, as he was revising it for publication in 1959, 1960? Charles Silver, who was a student of Cocchiarella's, he told me that he recalled the following from 1969 or 1970. This is a quotation from Silver. He says, after praising Kripke's work one time, Richard Montague mentioned that he too had a modal system as early as 1955, which was similar to Kripke's. After saying this, he paused, looked down at the table sadly, and said softly, but no completeness proofs. So what's revealed by the actual 1955 manuscript? Montague did in fact assert, though he doesn't exhibit, a completeness result for the propositional part of his axiom system. And a later version of the manuscript, which was partly typewritten, contains this amplification. A proof of the completeness and decidability of the system can be obtained without much difficulty from the ideas in the article of Weisberg. Weisberg was a Polish logician, a colleague of Lukasiewicz, who I'll be talking about a bit more later. What Montague did not claim is a completeness result for the quantified version of his system. And in a later section of the 1955 manuscript, which in fact was completely omitted from the 1960 published version, Montague did add quantifiers to the language, but there were no more completeness claims. And in this section, he said, it's been seen that n, which was his notation for box, of course, it's been seen that n can be eliminated in favor of quantifiers in the second-order predicate calculus. In fact, the theory which contains quantifiers and n and no other modal operators seems to lie between the first-order and second-order predicate calculus in power of expression. The first-order calculus can be completely axiomatized. The second-order calculus cannot. There is hope that the theory with n can be completely axiomatized. So the question of completeness for the quantified systems was, in Montague's mind, completely open in 1955. Despite his use of a binary relation, Montague mentioned no completeness results for systems lacking the S5 axiom. And of course, you only really need the binary relation if you are looking at systems weaker than S5. And the binary relation functioned for Montague only to ensure that the despised formula box A, arrow A was not going to be validated in all models. Montague offered no interpretation of the binary relation, either in the 1955 manuscript or the 1960 paper. It's just an uninterpreted bit of technical apparatus as far as he's concerned. And moreover, his binary relation holds between models and not between points or indices interpretable as possible worlds. It was Meredith and Pryor who took that step the following year. In the years that followed, Montague worked on the completeness problem for sentential modal logics together with Donald Kalish. Kalish told me that they obtained many partial results and that these were to be presented at an APA meeting in late December 1959. But then shortly before the meeting, they saw an abstract by Kripke in the December issue of the Journal of Symbolic Logic, which announced completeness results for a wide range of modal systems. Kalish told me that they were so astonished when they saw this abstract that they simply withdrew their own paper. And Kripke, of course, as everyone knows at this time, was still a schoolboy in Omaha, Nebraska. So he proved the completeness of S5, while he was a teenager. Kaplan told me that Montague was curious to know whether the S. Kripke, named as the author of this abstract, was a man or a woman. And then Kalish said everyone was so surprised when it turned out that Kripke was in fact a child. There's a famous review of one of Kripke's 1963 papers by Kaplan, and he said that in 1955, quote, Montague suggested the interpretation of modal calculi in terms of a relation between worlds. Kaplan's statement is highly misleading, since the binary relation considered in Montague's 1955 manuscript is a relation between models, and at no point in the manuscript does Montague suggest that the relation be understood as holding between worlds. The notion of a possible world was simply absent from Montague's 1955 work. And his 1955 theory, I think, is best regarded not as an example of early possible world semantics as such, but simply an attempt to extend Tarskian model theory to the modal case. It's not really, it's sort of off the line of development of early possible world semantics, although, of course, very relevant. So next, Meredith and Prior in 1956. Prior and Meredith first met here in Oxford in the summer of 1956, spending time together in Oxford and then in Dublin, where Meredith taught at Trinity College. In his 1962 paper, Possible Worlds, Prior presented various possible world semantics for various propositional modal systems. And he gave the impression that the material he was setting out represented an independent line of development by Meredith and himself. And there was no mention of Kripke's 1959 paper. And I can vividly remember sitting in the Radcliffe Science Library here many years ago when I was a graduate student, reading this paper of Prior's and thinking, how come he doesn't mention Kripke? Prior certainly knew of Kripke's 1959 paper at this stage because he himself had reviewed it for the Journal of Symbolic Logic. Kripke was, I told Kripke that, and Kripke was absolutely delighted to hear that Prior had been the reviewer for his paper. And he sort of reciprocated by saying that, well, it was reading a paper of Prior's that had actually got Kripke interested in modal logic in the first place, which I found very interesting. But anyway, there's no mention of Kripke in Prior's 1962 paper. So was the development in the 1962 paper independent of Kripke or not? In my collection, Logic and Reality, that was really the publication follow-up to the first Prior conference 25 years ago, celebrating his the 75th anniversary, which of course was in Christchurch in New Zealand. In that collection, I published a 1956 typescript by Meredith and Prior, and the existence of this typescript confirms that the development that Prior sets out in the 1962 Possible Worlds paper was in fact independent work by Meredith and Prior, which borrowed nothing from Kripke. So I've got the paper here. It was circulated by Prior in mimeograph form, and I found it in the archives of the University of Canterbury Library. Prior had left a copy of it behind when he left New Zealand for the United Kingdom in the late 50s. So this short typescript anticipates key elements in the modern possible world semantics for T, S4, and S5. So we've got recursive-like clauses for the propositional connectives up the top there. Of course, Prior is writing them in Polish, N for negation and C for conditional. And then we've got the modal clauses, L, necessity, M, possibility. And then there's some axioms setting out familiar-looking conditions on his binary relation, which he wrote as U, of course. And then they go on to derive various propositional axioms using their semantical apparatus. And to the modern eye, it all looks very, very familiar, I think, remarkably familiar, but also remarkably strange, because there are no truth conditions, no meta-language, no set theoretic constructs offered as semantic values of expressions of the object language. As you can see, the calculus set out in this note is purely formal, and the two of them offered no philosophical explanation whatsoever, either of the U relation or of the nature of the objects that are being quantified over in the modal clauses. Once the property calculus had been suitably explained, though, the Meredith-Prior approach becomes a paradigm example of what I'm calling translational semantics. And it was really in his 1962 paper that Prior set about producing the appropriate philosophical explanation of the terms that are purely formal in this 1956 semantics. And before long, he was calling the objects of the calculus possible worlds, and he was calling the U relation a relation of accessibility between worlds. And with the calculus explained in this way, he referred to the clauses for L and M as providing what he called an interpretation of the modal expressions. And he said that by reference to this interpretation, quote, many features of the logic of necessity and possibility are readily explained. Turning briefly to the history of the property calculus, Meredith had developed the calculus in Dublin before he met Prior. Lukasiewicz, also in Dublin, had drawn Meredith's attention to a 1933 paper by Weisberg, who'd been one of Lukasiewicz's colleagues in Poland. This is the same paper by Weisberg that we saw Montague mentioning. His paper contained an extended calculus of classes equivalent to S5. And Weisberg simulated the necessity operator in his calculus by means of an expression that he read, the predicate X applies to all objects. Prior related that Meredith reformulated Weisberg's calculus and called the result the property calculus. This was several years before Prior and Meredith's first meeting in 1956. And Meredith mentioned the property calculus in a note written as early as 1953. In his property calculus, Meredith reinterpreted propositions as properties of certain unspecified objects, which he just wrote as A, B, C, etc. He expressed these properties by means of monadic predicates, and he wrote PA to symbolize the assertion that object A has property P. He treated the modal proposition necessarily P as the assertion that P is a property of every object. And the statement that P is a property of every object, he in turn regarded as a property possessed either by all objects or by none. So in some ways it's looking very modern already. The similarities with Prior's earlier tensological procedure are marked. Meredith treated propositions as properties of certain objects, while Prior treated propositions as properties of times. And Prior read his PT as P at T. Whether Prior had sent Meredith the typescript in which he set this idea out, the typescript corresponding to the 1954 Wellington Address, isn't known. I've never been able to find that out. But quite possibly the two had arrived independently at what's essentially one and the same idea. I suspect that that was the case. We're looking at two roughly identical but completely independent developments here. The 1956 typescript, just one page in length, extended Meredith's property calculus with the binary relation U. And the typescript carries the attribution CAM, August 1956, recorded and expanded by ANP. And it seems that what Prior expanded was a brief note in Meredith's hand. I found this note in the archives in the Bodleian Library a few years ago. And it's just 8 lines of symbols, nothing else. It's classic Meredith, who, you know, liked his every pronouncement to be as compressed as possible. But what Meredith did was set down the reflexivity and transitivity axioms for U, the clauses for negation and implication, and the definition of L. basically part of the apparatus here. And then he listed K, T, and S4 as theses, and then he marked S5 with the reversed assertion sign, which Lukasiewicz used to represent rejection. Since the 1956 note is purely formal, the question immediately arises, well, did Prior and Meredith have the possible worlds interpretation of the objects of their calculus at that time? I mean, it's certainly the case that Prior was thinking in this way in his 1962 Possible Worlds paper on modal semantics. He said, suppose we have the, I think this is one of the, possibly one of the quotes that you put up yesterday, Max, I'm not sure. He said, suppose we have the usual variables, P, Q, R, etc. for statements, and A, B, C, etc. for names of worlds or total states of affairs. Let us then write PA, for it is the case in world A that P. But that was later, 1962, and by this time Prior is well familiar with Kripke's 1959 paper. I suggested to Kripke that Prior and Meredith had, independently and earlier than Kripke, a possible worlds form of the possible world semantics in 1956. And Kripke said, well, you know, I'm really not convinced about that. And he responded by saying that if they had possessed the possible worlds interpretation of their formalism in 1956, then Prior could so easily have said so in this note. For example, just by including the statement that I just read out. Why, you know, if they had had the possible worlds interpretation of the objects of the calculus, why wouldn't Prior have noted it, Kripke says. And then moreover, he went on to say, there's a sentence in Prior's book, Past, Present and Future, that can be interpreted as saying that it was Geach who first suggested to Prior several years later that the letters A, B, C, etc. of the calculus might be taken to name possible worlds. I put the sentence on a slide. It was later suggested by Geach that we might take A, B, C, etc. to name worlds, and UAB to mean that world B is accessible from world A. So Kripke said that on the basis of this evidence, it seems fair to conclude that the possible worlds interpretation of the calculus was unknown to Meredith and Prior in 1956. However, I think it's absolutely clear that Meredith and Prior were familiar with the possible worlds interpretation that early. And there survives a letter from Meredith to Prior dated 10th of October 1956, in which Meredith used the term possible world. So this is the same year, of course, as they set out the one-page 1956 note. And there's Meredith talking about possible worlds in a letter to Prior in that very year. And moreover, in the letter, Meredith expounded a sophisticated theory of worlds. And in a 1965 commentary on all this, Prior explained Meredith's concept of a world proposition. A world proposition PI is true at one and only one world I, and is equivalent to the conjunction of all propositions true in the ith possible world. In a note written in 1953, Meredith singled out one world proposition and added it to the language of his modal calculus in the form of a propositional constant n. And in a letter written in 1956, he called n the world, in the sense, he said, of everything that is the case. In the language of world propositions, world proposition n is equivalent to the conjunction of all propositions true in the actual world. So Meredith's constant n clearly bears on this question of whether or not it's fair to say that he and Prior had a possible worlds interpretation of the indices of their calculus as early as 1956. When Meredith added his constant n to the property calculus in 1953, he treated n as the property of being identical to a selected object, which he very suggestively designated A. In other words, for any object x, n is a property of x if and only if x is identical to A, the actual world. Evidently, Meredith was thinking of the objects of his property calculus as worlds long before 1956. So turning now from the objects of the calculus to the binary relation U, it seems that neither Meredith nor Prior had any interpretation to offer of the U relation in 1956. In 1960, Geach, by a complete coincidence, provided an interpretation of the U relation in a letter that he wrote to Prior. This was 3 years before Kripke's first publication mentioning the binary relation. Geach told me that he himself didn't know anything about the property calculus that Prior and Meredith were, spent a lot of their time fiddling around with. And nor was Geach at this time familiar with Kripke's 1959 papers even. He was much more interested in science fiction, and he saw this way of kind of coupling modal logic with science fiction. And I've actually got the letter that he wrote to Prior here on a slide. He says, here's a thing that might amuse you, since you combine an interest in modal logic and in science fiction. I'm sure you're very familiar with the science fiction stories in which there are possible worlds that you can reach by machine. It occurs to me that the systems between S4 and S5 inclusive can all be characterized in terms of different suppositions as to the possibilities of world jumping. So L equals in the world we are in, and in every world we can jump to from it, it is the case that. And M equals in the world we are in, or in some world we can jump to from it, it is the case that. Then the S4 reduction just means that my being able to jump to a world that either is the world W or is a world I can jump to from W is to count as being able to jump to W. The S5 reduction means that I can jump from any world to any world. Other hypotheses as to my jumping abilities, e.g. that I can jump from W prime to W, if I can jump from W to W prime, would give intermediate logics. I think this model may be useful, Geach said. Surely one of the greatest understatements in the history of modal logic. Geach told me that he used the term trans-world airlines for this voyaging between possible worlds. And he said that he himself never took his formalism particularly seriously, and that he attached no ontological significance to the idea of other worlds. He thought of them as just a useful imaginative device, he said, and nothing more. But Prior seized on Geach's idea and took to describing U as a relation of accessibility between different possible worlds. And in 1962, he wrote, let us interpret LPA, necessarily P in world A, as short for P is true in A and in all worlds accessible from it. So, showing no interest in truth conditional semantics, Prior has provided interpretations of modal statements by translating them systematically into a more perspicuous language. How am I doing for time, Max?
We're over time already.
Oh, am I?
We won't have time for questions.
Did we not start late, though? He attempted to negotiate crassly.
Yes, it's still about 4 minutes late. So perhaps there are 2 minutes.
All right.
Either to finish or to have a question.
No, I finished.
Okay, we have a very quick question, unless we're all desperately hungry.
I've had this question for a long time, and it has to do with the relation between the terms states of affairs and possible worlds. Is it clear, or where is it clear and where is it not clear, that when any of the people you're talk about states of affairs, they talk about what we would now call possible worlds, or what we now would call situations?
Yes.
Is how much is it understood that state of affairs means total state of affairs?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. I mean, they certainly talked about possible states of affairs, and the world proposition stuff is very suggestive. But it's like a separate historical project to go through the historical record and attempt to settle that very interesting question. And it would be great if a graduate student or someone connected with the Prior archive took that very question on, because it is open at the moment. I suspect the answer will turn out to be that they were thinking, or some of them anyway, were thinking of what we would now call as possible worlds rather than situations. But I'm sure there's an interesting story to be discovered there.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.